The story began on a quiet suburban street, where manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges created the illusion of harmony. Every driveway held the same types of cars, every front porch displayed the same bland welcome mats, and every yard looked like it had been copy-pasted out of a real estate brochure. This was the neighborhood governed by the Homeowners Association, an organization that prided itself on uniformity, order, and control. For years, the HOA had imposed its will with an iron grip. Fences could not be painted without approval. Mailboxes had to be a certain shade of beige. Even flower beds were limited to specific arrangements, carefully documented in the handbook. But the most bizarre rule of all concerned garden statues. According to the bylaws, no resident was allowed to display ornamental statuary of any size, color, or design in their front yards. The reasoning was vague, claiming such objects disrupted the visual cohesion of the community. It seemed absurd to most residents, but they complied. A stone gnome or angel here and there might not have hurt anyone, but those who tried were swiftly fined into submission. For years, this rule sat unchallenged, until one homeowner decided enough was enough. That homeowner was me. I had never been particularly rebellious. I had moved into the neighborhood for the same reasons everyone else did: good schools, quiet streets, and property values that promised to rise. At first, I tolerated the rules, even chuckling when the HOA nitpicked over a neighbor's lawn height. But then came the letter. It wasn't even about me initially. A neighbor down the street had placed a small stone rabbit by her flower bed. Barely visible from the sidewalk, it was harmless, whimsical even. Yet the HOA descended upon her with fines and warnings until she removed it. I watched the entire ordeal unfold, disgusted by the pettiness. That's when the spark was lit. If the HOA wanted to dictate what could or could not stand on my lawn, then perhaps it was time to test just how far their rulebook could be pushed. The idea came to me late one evening as I scrolled through online listings. Among the endless ads for garden decor, one particular item stood out: plastic flamingos. Bright pink, absurdly cheerful, and completely tacky in the best possible way. They weren't statues in the traditional sense. They were lawn ornaments, lightweight and hollow, technically falling outside the HOA's definition of ornamental statuary. A loophole. I ordered a dozen. When they arrived, I planted them proudly across my lawn. Neighbors chuckled as they passed by, assuming it was a temporary gag. But I had no intention of removing them. Days later, the first HOA letter arrived in my mailbox. The tone was stern, dripping with authority, claiming my flamingos violated the rules. I reread the section of the bylaws and smiled. They were wrong. These were not statues. They were decorations. And in the precise, technical language of the HOA, nothing prohibited them. I wrote back with a firm response, quoting their own handbook. Silence followed. For a brief moment, I thought I had won, but the HOA wasn't finished. Weeks later, another letter came, rephrased, demanding removal. Once again, I countered with their own language. They grew more desperate, threatening fines, though the enforcement committee seemed hesitant to act without airtight justification. My flamingos stood tall, defiant in their ridiculousness. And then the true war began. If a dozen flamingos could rattle them, why stop there? I ordered more. Dozens more. Soon my yard became a sea of pink plastic birds, their skinny legs poking into the grass, their curved necks stretching upward as if mocking the uniformity of the neighborhood. Drivers slowed down to pee. Children laughed. Neighbors whispered, some amused, some horrified. The HOA seethed. Each morning I added new recruits to my growing army. A flamingo on the porch, a flamingo by the mailbox, a flamingo staring directly into the president's house across the street. The sheer absurdity became my weapon. I had found a way to expose the pettiness of the HOA by drowning them in pink. Soon my lawn transformed into a local spectacle. People from outside the neighborhood began driving by just to see it. Social media posts circulated. Flamingo House, they called it. While others might have been embarrassed, I reveled in the attention. The more the HOA pushed back, the more flamingos I added. But with the growing spectacle came growing tension. Neighbors who had once smiled now frowned, worried about property values, worried about the wrath of the HOA. Whispers grew louder. Would they try to force me out? Would they escalate beyond letters? The HOA called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I heard the news secondhand. They were drafting new amendments to specifically outlaw flamingos or any repetitive ornamental displays. They wanted to crush my rebellion, rewrite the rules just to stop me. And that was when I realized this was no longer just about flamingos. This was about control, about whether the HOA could bend reality to its will, even retroactively, about whether homeowners like me had any freedom at all. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the HOA, armed with its rule books, fines, and committees. On the other stood me and my ever-growing flock of pink soldiers. And as I ordered yet another shipment, this time 100 flamingos strong, I knew this war was far from over. Because if they thought my lawn army was ridiculous now, they hadn't seen anything yet. The flamingo army grew bolder with every passing week. My yard was no longer just a lawn, but a statement, a pink battlefield of absurdity that tested the patience of the homeowners association at every turn. Each morning I would step outside, coffee in hand, and admire the flock, lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. Some stood guard near the sidewalk, others gathered around the flower beds, and a few stood sentinel near the mailbox. They were ridiculous, yes, but they had become symbols of resistance. The HOA, however, was not amused. The first wave of retaliation came in the form of escalating fines. A letter arrived, crisp and officious, declaring that I now owed $200 for non-compliance with community aesthetics. The following week, the fines doubled. By the third week, the total balance demanded had ballooned into the thousands. But I did not pay a cent. Each fine relied on the assumption that the flamingos were ornamental statuary. And as I had argued before, they were not. I ignored the letters, stacking them neatly in a folder like trophies. Each envelope represented another attempt by the HOA to bully me into submission. Each ignored fine reminded me that their authority was not absolute, but the HOA was relentless. Soon, committee members began driving slowly past my house, clipboards in hand, muttering to one another as they inspected my lawn. Some even stepped onto the sidewalk, pointing at specific flamingos, jotting down notes as though documenting a crime scene. The entire spectacle became theater, and the audience, my neighbors, watched nervously from behind curtains. The neighborhood began to fracture. Some residents supported me, quietly dropping words of encouragement when they passed by. Others, however, grew irritated. They muttered about property values, about embarrassment, about not wanting to live next to a circus. The Flamingo Army had drawn a line through the community, and everyone was forced to choose a side. Whispers traveled faster than the mail. At the local grocery store, I overheard neighbors debating my lawn as though it were breaking news. At the gas station, I caught strangers giggling, calling me the Flamingo guy. Online forums lit up with pictures and speculation. What had started as a small rebellion had now transformed into a spectacle far beyond the HOA's control. Desperation seeped through the cracks of their authority. They scheduled a mandatory community meeting, announcing it with a thick packet slipped into every mailbox. The agenda was clear. Address the Flamingo situation. On the evening of the meeting, the community clubhouse overflowed with residents. The air buzzed with tension. Although I did not speak, I listened carefully as the HOA board members ranted, their voices dripping with frustration. They accused me of mocking the rules, of creating an eyesore, of undermining everything the HOA stood for. They claimed my actions were selfish, disruptive, and potentially damaging to property values. But not everyone agreed. A surprising number of neighbors defended me. They argued that the flamingos were harmless, even charming. They accused the HOA of overreach, of spending too much energy on petty rules instead of focusing on real issues like road maintenance or neighborhood safety. For the first time in years, the HOA faced open dissent. The room grew heated, voices clashing, accusations flying. The board tried to regain control, but the floodgates had opened. People were no longer afraid to question the system. The meeting ended in chaos, unresolved, but one thing was clear. The Flamingos had cracked the illusion of HOA dominance. Still, the board was determined to crush me. Within days, they began drafting new amendments. Word spread quickly that they intended to outlaw flamingos specifically, along with any repetitive ornamental displays. The language was broad enough to cover not just my army, but any creative expression a homeowner might attempt in the future. But amendments required votes, and votes required persuasion. The HOA launched a campaign, sending out glossy flyers warning of community decline and reputation damage. They painted a grim picture of falling home values and unwelcome attention. The flamingos, they argued, were not whimsical, they were dangerous. I, too, began to prepare. Quietly, I rallied supporters. Neighbors who had once been too timid now saw the importance of standing up. Some even offered to host flamingos in their own yards in solidarity. The idea of a flamingo revolution spread like wildfire, and soon pink birds began appearing here and there across the neighborhood. My lone rebellion was no longer solitary. It had sparked a movement. The HOA panicked. The more they tried to tighten their grip, the more flamingos slipped through their fingers. They issued warnings to anyone who displayed one, but the resistance had taken root. A single flamingo in a flower bed, another near a walkway. It was as though the flock had multiplied beyond my lawn, infiltrating the entire community. The absurdity had become contagious, but with every victory came new risks. Rumors circulated that the HOA was considering legal action, possibly even liens against my home. They wanted to make an example of me, to prove that defiance carried consequences. Neighbors whispered about lawsuits, about court battles, about the possibility of foreclosure. Yet I did not waver. My flamingos remained in formation, a garish, unyielding army. And each day, as the HOA grew more desperate, I felt the momentum shifting. The battle was no longer about plastic birds. It was about power, about freedom, about the right to say that a lawn belonged to its owner, not a committee. And as the sun set on another day, casting long shadows across the pink silhouettes, I knew the war was only just beginning. Because the HOA was preparing its next move, and it would not be subtle. The neighborhood had become a battlefield without gunfire. On one side stood the HOA, clutching its bylaws and wielding fines like weapons. On the other side stood me, my lawn, and a growing flock of flamingos that had become symbols of defiance. What had started as a petty disagreement about ornaments now rippled through every street, every household, forcing neighbors to confront questions they had long ignored. Who really owned their homes, themselves, or the association? The HOA's next move was calculated, cold, and ruthless. It arrived not in the form of another warning letter or fine, but in a thick envelope stamped with the logo of a law firm. Inside, legal jargon spelled out their intentions in sharp, sterile language. They were suing me. The claims were sweeping: violation of community standards, damages to property values, disruption of neighborhood harmony. They sought thousands of dollars in penalties, plus an injunction demanding the removal of every flamingo. The message was clear. This was no longer a skirmish. This was war. I remember standing in my driveway the day I received the letter, staring at the pink flock surrounding me. Their plastic faces tilted toward the sky, oblivious, but somehow still defiant. To anyone else, they were tacky decorations. To me, they were soldiers, and this lawsuit was the HOA's attempt to annihilate them. Word spread quickly. By evening, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some shook their heads, claiming I had gone too far. Others offered quiet encouragement, slipping notes of support into my mailbox, urging me not to give in. But beneath the chatter, one truth became undeniable. The HOA had escalated the conflict to a level none of us could ignore. The weeks leading up to the court date were tense. Flamingos multiplied across my yard, but now they stood under the shadow of looming legal threats. Committee members patrolled the streets like watchmen, documenting every detail, as though preparing evidence for trial. Neighbors peeked through blinds, afraid to be seen, taking sides. And still, the Pink Army grew, because retreat was not an option. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt more like a theater than a hall of justice. Rows of seats filled with residents from my neighborhood, some curious, others furious. The HOA board sat stiffly in the front row, their lawyer armed with binders full of complaints and photographs of my lawn. And there I sat, alone but resolute, with a single folder of my own, copies of the bylaws, carefully highlighted to expose their loopholes. The proceedings unfolded like a drama. The HOA's lawyer painted me as a reckless homeowner, someone whose flamingo obsession endangered the reputation of the entire community. He spoke of declining property values, of embarrassed residents, of rules ignored and order undermined. He presented photographs of my yard as though they were evidence of a crime. But when it was my turn, I leaned on the very foundation of their authority, their rules. Calmly, methodically, I read aloud the section on ornamental statuary. Nowhere did it mention flamingos. Nowhere did it prohibit lawn ornaments. The language was precise, and my flock had slipped through the cracks of their definitions. The judge listened, expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick. On one side, the HOA demanded compliance. On the other, I argued for freedom, for individuality, for the right to decorate my own yard as I pleased. The ruling did not come immediately. The judge postponed the decision, requesting more documentation. It was a temporary reprieve, but it was enough. Outside the courthouse, cameras clicked. Local reporters had caught wind of the Flamingo lawsuit. My lawn had already been a local spectacle, but now it was news. Headlines appeared the next morning. Homeowner sued over Flamingo Army. What had once been neighborhood gossip was now a public story. The HOA's attempt to silence me had backfired, amplifying the absurdity of their crusade, and the neighborhood felt the shift. Supporters grew bolder, planting flamingos of their own in quiet rebellion. Some displayed just one, tucked near a flower bed or hidden among shrubs, a silent nod of solidarity. Others went further, creating miniature flocks in their front yards. The community was no longer uniform. Splashes of pink dotted the once boring streets, a visual reminder that the HOA's grip was slipping. But not everyone celebrated. Opponents grew angrier, accusing me of dragging the neighborhood into chaos. They muttered about falling home values, about outsiders driving by to gawk, about the circus atmosphere overtaking their once quiet street. The divide deepened. Friendships fractured. Barbecues ended in arguments. And the HOA doubled down. New amendments were drafted, this time broader, harsher. They proposed rules against excessive displays of any kind, vague enough to cover anything they disliked. They wanted to shut the door on loopholes permanently. Flyers warned of the dangers of unchecked ornamentation, painting nightmarish visions of neighborhoods overrun with plastic, clutter, and chaos. Yet every attempt to scare residents only seemed to strengthen the rebellion. One evening, as I stood in my yard, I noticed something remarkable. The sunset cast a golden glow across the rows of flamingos, their silhouettes stretching long and surreal. And in that moment, I realized something. The HOA had lost control. Even if they won the lawsuit, even if they fined me into bankruptcy, they had already been exposed. Their petty obsession with control was out in the open, visible to everyone, undeniable. But the war was not over. The judge's decision still loomed. The HOA still had money, lawyers, and influence, and I had only flamingos. Plastic birds could not pay court fees. They could not erase liens. They could not shield me from the very real possibility that I might lose my home. And yet, as the neighborhood fractured and the rebellion spread, I knew I could not stop. The flamingos had become bigger than me. They were a statement, a movement, a line drawn in pink plastic against unchecked authority. The HOA thought a lawsuit would crush me. Instead, it had lit a fire they could not extinguish. The courtroom battle was just the beginning, because now the whole world was watching. The lawsuit should have been the HOA's moment of triumph. They had brought lawyers, paperwork, and threats of crushing penalties. They had attempted to box me in with fines and amendments, to bury me under the weight of their authority. But the very act of dragging me into court had done something they never expected. It had made the Flamingo Rebellion famous. The first article appeared in the local paper, a small column buried among stories about city council meetings and weather forecasts. But soon, larger outlets picked it up. The story spread from local news stations to regional networks, then spilled into the endless stream of online media. The headlines grew more dramatic with each retelling. Homeowner swed for Flamingo Army. HOA declares war on plastic birds. Neighborhood divided by pink uprising. Social media carried the story further than any newspaper could. Photos of my lawn circulated online, drawing both laughter and outrage. Comment sections exploded. Some praised me as a hero standing up against petty authority. Others mocked me as a stubborn troublemaker, clinging to plastic toys. Memes appeared overnight. Flamingos photoshopped into battlefields. Flamingos in superhero capes. Flamingos standing victorious over HOA rule books. What had started as a neighborhood squabble was now a spectacle. Cars began to roll through the streets, not just from nearby neighborhoods, but from other towns, even other states. Drivers slowed down to gawk at the lawn army, snapping photos from car windows. Families stopped to take selfies. Oh, and weekends, the street grew crowded, lined with parked cars as visitors came to see the infamous Flamingo house. For some neighbors, it was amusing. For others, it was infuriating. Complaints poured into the HOA about traffic, noise, and outsiders cluttering the streets. But the more they complained, the more attention it drew. The HOA board, once used to ruling quietly, now found themselves the subject of public ridicule. Their carefully cultivated image of order and respectability crumbled. At first, they tried to defend themselves. In interviews, board members insisted they were only upholding the rules, preserving property values, protecting the community from decline. But their words rang hollow against the backdrop of pink plastic soldiers gleaming in the sunlight. Every soundbite, every stern explanation only fed the fire. The public wasn't interested in their reasoning. They were interested in the absurdity of an HOA declaring war on flamingos. The story spread further. National news picked it up. Talk shows joked about it in their opening monologues. Radio hosts debated it during morning commutes. Bloggers dissected the symbolism, calling it a modern parable about control and individuality. Even late-night comedians mocked the HOA, portraying them as bureaucrats trembling before a flock of plastic birds. And through it all, the flamingos remained, silent and unyielding. The attention changed everything. Suddenly, I was no longer just a homeowner fighting my HOA. I was a symbol, whether I wanted to be or not. People sent me letters of support from across the country. Packages arrived at my door, boxes filled with flamingos, sent by strangers eager to contribute to the rebellion. My yard overflowed with reinforcements, each new arrival a reminder that this battle had grown far beyond my control. The neighborhood, however, strained under the pressure. Supporters painted flamingos on mailboxes, wore flamingo shirts, even hosted flamingo-themed block parties. Opponents, meanwhile, grew angrier, blaming me for the circus atmosphere. Long-time friendships fractured. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street to avoid one another. The streets echoed with muttered complaints and heated arguments. The HOA, humiliated but stubborn, refused to back down. They tightened their grip, issuing more fines, threatening more lawsuits, rewriting rules with desperate urgency. Their newsletters dripped with anger, warning residents that the Flamingo plague was destroying the integrity of the community. They urged everyone to remember their duty to protect property values at all costs. But the words rang empty. Every morning I stood in my driveway, coffee in hand, watching as visitors posed for photos beside my flamingos. Every evening, I saw the streetlights glinting off their pink plastic feathers, casting strange shadows across the grass. And in those quiet moments, I realized the battle had outgrown me. It was no longer just about my lawn. It was about every resident who had ever been fined for a slightly tall blade of grass. Every homeowner told their mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Every person scolded for hanging the wrong color curtains or planting the wrong kind of flowers. The flamingos had become avatars of resistance, not just here but everywhere. The rebellion had gone viral. But as the world laughed and cheered, the HOA seethed. Their power had been undermined, their authority mocked, their reputation shattered. And when powerful people feel cornered, they don't surrender easily. They scheme, they plot, they prepare their next strike. I could see it in their faces during the next HOA board meeting. Though attendance was larger than ever, though residents heckled them openly, their eyes remained cold, calculating. They spoke less about rules and more about consequences. They warned of liens, foreclosures, legal fees that could drown even the most defiant homeowner. They wanted to remind me and everyone that beneath the plastic, birds, and viral fame, they still held real weapons, and they were preparing to use them. The neighborhood was no longer just divided. It was fragile, on the brink of breaking. One wrong move could tip everything into chaos. And as I stood in my yard that night, surrounded by flamingos glowing faintly in the moonlight, I understood something chilling. The HOA was no longer fighting to protect property values. They were fighting for survival, and they were willing to destroy anyone or anything that threatened their control. The laughter was fading. What had once been a circus of flamingos, memes, and viral headlines was beginning to shift into something darker. The HOA had endured months of humiliation, dragged through news cycles and mocked across the country. They had been called petty tyrants, laughed at by late-night comedians, and buried under flamingo deliveries from strangers. Yet they did not crumble. They hardened. Their desperation sharpened into cruelty. The first sign came as a notice posted directly to my door, sealed in official lettering. Unlike the familiar fines, this paper bore a more ominous phrase: Notice of Lien. According to the HOA, my unpaid fines, though illegitimate in my eyes, had now accumulated to a staggering total. They claimed I owed tens of thousands of dollars, and until it was paid, they were placing a lien on my home. The implications were chilling. A lien meant I could not sell, I could not refinance, and if left unresolved, it gave them the power to push for foreclosure. It was their nuclear option. Neighbors whispered as word spread. Some gasped in sympathy, horrified that the HOA would go so far. Others muttered that I had brought it on myself, that my stubbornness had finally cornered me. The once lively rebellion now carried an undercurrent of fear. If they could threaten me with foreclosure, what could they do to anyone else? But fear is a dangerous thing. It can silence people, or it can ignite them. I refused to back down. The lien was their weapon, but it also exposed them for what they were. An organization willing to ruin someone's life over plastic birds. I made sure the world knew it. Copies of the lien appeared online, spread across forums and social media. News outlets reported on it, painting the HOA not as protectors of property values, but as villains waging financial war over lawn decorations. The backlash was immediate. Outrage poured in from beyond the neighborhood. Commentators decried the abuse of power, calling it an attack on homeowners everywhere. Donations began to arrive from strangers who wanted to help me fight. Legal groups reached out, offering advice. The Flamingo rebellion was no longer just a joke. It had become a movement against unchecked HOA authority. Still, the pressure inside the neighborhood was immense. Supporters decorated their lawns with flamingos, yes, but many did so nervously, fearful of retaliation. Others tore theirs down entirely, unwilling to risk fines or liens. Block parties that once celebrated the rebellion dissolved into tense silences. The HOA board stalked the streets like predators, documenting every violation, every pink bird, every act of defiance. And yet, despite their threats, the flamingos multiplied. My yard remained an ocean of pink, joined now by allies who planted their own flocks in quiet solidarity. Even as the board threatened foreclosure, the rebellion refused to die. The HOA escalated further. They called an emergency vote, proposing a special amendment that would grant them broader foreclosure powers against repeat violators. Flyers landed in mailboxes dripping with alarmist language, warning that my rebellion threatened the entire neighborhood's future. They painted me not as a neighbor, but as an enemy. The meeting to decide the amendment was unlike anything the community had ever seen. The clubhouse overflowed with residents, reporters, and even protesters from outside the neighborhood. The air crackled with tension as the board tried to regain control. They lectured about responsibility, about order, about protecting home values. They pointed at me, seated quietly in the back, as though I were a criminal. But something remarkable happened. The room turned on them. Neighbors, people who had once kept their heads down, stood up and spoke. They demanded answers about how much money the HOA had spent on legal fees. They questioned the obsession with my flamingos when real community issues went ignored. They accused the board of bullying, of abusing power, of dragging everyone into a nightmare that could have been avoided. The board squirmed. Their authority, once unquestioned, was collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. The vote ended in chaos. Though they tried to push through their amendment, too many residents had seen through the fear-mongering. The rebellion had fractured the illusion of control. The HOA no longer spoke with one voice. But victory was far from certain. The lien still stood, the foreclosure threat still loomed, and the board, humiliated yet again, would not stop until I was crushed, or until they were. The nights grew restless. I would sit on my porch, the flamingos glowing faintly in the moonlight, wondering how far this battle could go. Could they really take my home over pink plastic birds? Could they really gamble the neighborhood's future on their obsession with control? The answer, I realized, was yes. They could. But so could I. For I had nothing left to lose but my home. And if they wanted to take it, they would have to face the sight of 1,000 flamingos standing in their way. The rebellion was reaching its breaking point, and one way or another, it was about to end. The lien had pushed everything to the edge. The HOA had gambled that financial ruin would break me, that fear of foreclosure would scatter my flamingo army and leave me humiliated. But instead, it set the stage for the rebellion's final act. The neighborhood could not remain in limbo forever. Something had to give. The last straw came not from me, but from the residents themselves. After months of escalating tension, after fines, lawsuits, amendments, and threats, the community's patience with the HOA snapped. The rebellion had pulled back the curtain, and everyone could see the truth. The HOA was no longer a guardian of order. It was an enforcer of fear. The final showdown began with a petition. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began to circulate papers calling for a vote to dissolve the current HOA board. Signatures spread like wildfire. Even those who disliked the Flamingos recognized that the board's obsession had gone too far. The legal bills, the endless letters, the threats of foreclosure, these were not the acts of leaders. They were the acts of tyrants. In just days, the petition gathered enough support to trigger a recall vote. The board panicked. They called another emergency meeting, desperate to regain control. The clubhouse filled to bursting, with residents, reporters, and curious outsiders packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was electric, charged with months of pent-up frustration. The board tried to speak, but their voices trembled. They warned of chaos if they were removed, of property values collapsing, of a neighborhood without guidance. They waved papers, shouted about rules, pleaded for order. But the words fell flat. Because outside on the lawn of the clubhouse stood hundreds of flamingos. Not just mine, not just those sent by strangers, but flamingos planted by neighbors, arranged in rows, glowing pink under strings of lights. They had carried them from their homes, marched them to the meeting, and staked them in the ground as silent witnesses. The board looked out the window at the pink sea, the air faces pale. The vote was swift. The residents raised, their hands, one by one, in overwhelming numbers. The board had lost. Their reign was over. The aftermath was chaos. Some board members stormed out, furious, vowing legal revenge. Others slumped in their seats, defeated. The crowd spilled outside, where cheers rose into the night air. Neighbors hugged, laughed, even cried. For the first time in months, the tension broke. The rebellion had won. The liens? Lifted. The fines? Canceled. The lawsuit? Dropped. The new leadership dissolved the absurd rules about statues and ornaments, replacing them with guidelines focused on actual community needs, safety, maintenance, fairness. The Flamingos had exposed the rot, and the residents refused to let it return. And as for my lawn, the army remained. Not as a weapon now, but as a monument. Rows of pink birds stretched across the grass, symbols of resistance, of absurdity turned into victory. Cars still drove by, tourists still stopped for photos, but now they weren't gawking at a feud. They were witnessing the story of how a neighborhood took back its freedom. The HOA had tried to crush me. They had threatened me, sued me, and attempted to take my home. But in the end, they destroyed themselves. Their obsession revealed their weakness. Their cruelty revealed their fragility, and a flock of plastic flamingos had brought them to their knees. The rebellion spread beyond our neighborhood. Other communities heard the story and began questioning their own HOAs. Online forums buzzed with homeowners inspired by the pink uprising, sharing tales of resistance against petty fines and absurd rules. The flamingos had become more than decorations. They had become a movement. Months later, I still walked my lawn each morning, coffee in hand, surrounded by my pink soldiers. Their curved necks glistened in the sunlight, their shadows stretched long in the grass, and their silent defiance reminded me of everything we had endured. What had started as a petty fight over statues had grown into a war over freedom and ended in victory. And though the flamingos stood quietly, I knew what they represented. That sometimes it takes something ridiculous to reveal something serious. That sometimes the smallest rebellion can topple the biggest tyrants. And that sometimes a lawn full of plastic birds can change everything. The HOA had said no to garden statues, but I built a flamingo army. And we won.